There are people who live their entire lives in the open, every move visible, every decision on display, and still manage to keep the most important things buried so deep that no one ever thinks to look. That is not an accident, that is a skill, and some people spend years quietly and carefully perfecting it. Camron Guthrie was one of those people. On the surface, everything about him made sense. The story added up, the image held together. The life he presented to the world was coherent and consistent, and for a long time that was more than enough. People saw what he showed them. They believed what felt believable. They moved on. Because when a picture is clean and a story is smooth, most people don't feel the need to look beneath it. But there is a specific kind of silence that only exists when something is being protected. Not the silence of a quiet life. Not the silence of someone who simply keeps to themselves. This is the silence of everything happening behind a door that is never allowed to open. People who knew Camron from the early days, those who watched him from the beginning, will tell you he was different. And not in the way people say that to be generous. Different in a way that made you pay attention. He was the kind of person who could walk into a room, read it in seconds, understand what every person in it needed from him, and then give it to them without hesitation, without effort. Every single time. That kind of ability is rare, genuinely rare, but it comes with something most people don't immediately consider. Because when someone is that good at reading other people, they are almost inevitably just as good at hiding from them. And for years, that is exactly what Camron did. Quietly, carefully. Methodically, he hid something. Something that a few people around him had begun to sense without being able to name. Something that, once it finally came into the light, made people look back at everything they thought they knew about him and realize the picture had never been complete. Stay with this. Before you can understand what was hidden, you have to understand what was shown, because the two are inseparable. You cannot appreciate the depth of a concealment without first understanding how convincing the surface was. Camron Guthrie did not appear to be a complicated person. That was, in many ways, entirely the point. He carried himself with a kind of effortless steadiness, the type of person who seems genuinely at ease in a world where most people are visibly struggling to hold things together. He spoke with care, he listened in a way that felt full and attentive. He remembered small details about people, things they had mentioned once in passing, and he brought those details back at exactly the right moments, in ways that made people feel genuinely known. That is not a small thing to offer someone. In a world that moves as fast as this one, in a culture where most interactions are surface level by necessity, the feeling of being truly seen by another person is something close to rare. And Camron had a natural, almost intuitive gift for creating it. He grew up in circumstances that were neither exceptional nor devastating, the kind of background that doesn't announce itself. He wasn't born into wealth. He wasn't raised in visible chaos. He existed somewhere in the comfortable middle, in the kind of ordinary that teaches a person early on that meaning isn't given to you. You find it, you build it, you figure out how to create it from whatever materials you have. Those who knew him in his younger years describe someone who was always observing. Not in a way that made people uneasy, in the way of someone who was simply paying close attention to everything, collecting information, filing it away. He had an almost instinctive understanding of how situations were going to unfold before they did. He read patterns the way other people read words, automatically, without effort. By the time he reached adulthood, that instinct had sharpened into something formidable. He moved through different social worlds without creating friction. He built relationships with an efficiency that, in hindsight, says something. He was, by nearly every external measure, someone who had figured out how to navigate life with unusual precision. And that precision was not limited to his personal relationships. It extended to everything, to the way he occupied professional spaces, to the way he managed his reputation, to the particular kind of presence he maintained, visible enough to be trusted, contained enough to never invite real scrutiny. The walls he built around himself didn't look like walls. They were constructed to look like openness, like transparency, like a person with nothing to hide. That is the defining quality of truly skilled concealment. It doesn't look like hiding. It looks like honesty, and for a long time, for longer than most people realized, it worked. The people around him accepted the version of Camron he offered. The professional world respected him. His reputation stayed intact. And whatever existed beneath the surface, whatever slow questions were beginning to form in the minds of people paying close attention, stayed exactly where he needed them to stay. Until one day they didn't. The years before anything changed were, from the outside, exactly what they appeared to be: stable, steady. Unremarkable in the way that comfortable lives often are, not because nothing was happening, but because what was happening followed a consistent and reassuring pattern. Camron had built something real, not loud, not the kind of success that announces itself or generates attention. The kind that accumulates slowly, quietly, convincingly, the kind that makes the people watching it think, this person knows exactly what they're doing. This person has it figured out. This person can be trusted. His professional identity was built entirely around reliability. Whatever the context, whatever field he occupied, whatever community he was part of, he was the person others called when they needed someone who would actually come through. He delivered. He followed through on things that other people quietly let slide. He showed up consistently, in the small moments and the large ones, in ways that people noticed and talked about. The kind of reputation that isn't built by grand gestures, it's built by the invisible accumulation of 1,000 smaller ones. His personal life looked the same way from the outside. Healthy relationships, appropriate presence, a careful avoidance of the kind of visible drama that makes people start asking questions. There was simply nothing on the surface that invited a closer look. And that combination, the professional credibility, the personal quietness, the total absence of obvious red flags, is precisely what made what came later so disorienting to everyone who had been close to it. Because here is the important part: the stability was real. That is the piece that is easy to overlook, and it matters. He hadn't constructed a hollow life and placed it over a broken one. The warmth was real, the accomplishments were real. The care he extended to the people around him was, by most accounts, genuine. None of that was performance, but something else was also real. Something that existed in parallel, running alongside everything visible, threading itself through the gaps between the moments people could see. Something that lived in the decisions made when no one was watching, in the conversations that happened away from everyone who knew him, in the version of himself that only a very small number of people had ever been allowed to encounter. The stability wasn't a lie, but it was incomplete. And the distance between what was visible and what was true, depending on how you choose to measure it, depending on whose experience you are sitting with, was either a minor omission or something considerably larger. The question that would eventually become impossible to set aside was this: did the people in Camron's life have a right to the full picture? And if they did, if they genuinely deserved to know, then why had it been kept from them, and for how long? Those answers did not come easily. They rarely do. It didn't start with something dramatic. No confrontation, no public accusation, no moment of explosive revelation that announced itself clearly. The beginning was much quieter than that, and in many ways much more unsettling for it. According to those familiar with the situation, the first real indication that something more complicated was at play didn't come from inside Camron's inner circle. It came from someone on the edges. Someone who didn't know him well enough to have loyalty to the image he had built, but knew him just well enough to notice when a small detail didn't quite land the way it should have. The specific nature of that detail has been described in different ways by different people. But the core of what they observed is consistent across accounts. There was a version of Camron Guthrie being shared carefully, selectively, with a very small number of people. A version that diverged, in ways that were difficult to immediately quantify, from the one the rest of the world had been receiving all along. In isolation, that isn't automatically alarming. Most people contain contradictions. Most people present differently depending on who they're with. The existence of a private self, a self that isn't offered to everyone, is not unusual. It is, in fact, a basic feature of being human. What made this different was not the existence of that private dimension. It was the degree of the separation, and it was the deliberateness behind it. Because there is a real difference between privacy and curation. When someone is simply private, when they are protecting something personal, something tender, something they don't feel ready to share, that privacy has a particular quality. It is quiet. It doesn't require active effort. They are simply not sharing, simply withholding. What the people who started paying closer attention began to describe was something that operated differently, more actively, a management of information. A deliberate arrangement of what each person in his life knew and when and to what degree. Not lying necessarily, not in any straightforward sense, but shaping, selecting, choreographing. And the clearer that pattern became, the heavier the questions it produced. Not questions about any single fact in isolation, but questions about the architecture of the whole thing. The sustained effort required to maintain it, the time it had apparently been in place. Questions have been raised by those who have looked at this situation carefully about who that effort was ultimately serving. Whether the people closest to him had, without knowing it, been participating in something they had never actually agreed to. None of those questions produced immediate answers. But once the first one was asked clearly, the rest came quickly behind it. There is a specific kind of discomfort that settles in when you realize the version of someone you were given, the version you built trust around. The version you made real decisions based on was a curated one. It doesn't feel exactly like being lied to. It is something more ambiguous than that, something that sits in a harder place to reach. Because you can't point to a single sentence where the deception occurred, you can't identify the exact moment the truth broke. Instead, you are left standing inside an accumulated impression, built from 100 ordinary interactions. 1,000 small moments, and realizing that the person you thought you were standing close to was always, somehow, slightly further away than they appeared. That is the position the people around Camron found themselves in as the picture began to expand. The information that emerged during this period did not arrive cleanly. It came the way difficult truths usually come, in fragments, through conversations that felt like they were resolving something but kept leaving threads loose. Through answers that satisfied just enough to prevent further questioning, but not quite enough to produce genuine certainty. Through patterns that, once you began to recognize them, you couldn't stop seeing in everything that had come before. Those who examined the details of this situation closely have noted that what Camron had maintained was not a simple or casual thing. It required consistency, sustained attention, a level of deliberate management that, according to reports, had been in place for a significant period of time, long enough that it had shaped real decisions, affected real relationships, produced real consequences for people who had been making choices without access to the full picture. What those consequences were, specifically, varied depending on who you asked. For some, the primary impact was cognitive, a disorienting reordering of memory. Looking back at experiences they thought they understood and realizing that the meaning they had assigned to them at the time was not the only meaning available. That there were layers they hadn't seen and couldn't have seen because the information that would have revealed them had been deliberately managed. For others, the effects were more concrete. Decisions had been made, real ones with real consequences, trust had been extended, paths had been chosen. And all of it had happened, at least in part, on the basis of a version of this person that was not, it turned out, the complete one. Whether that rises to the level of harm, and what kind of harm it might be, is a question that no official conclusion has yet been reached on. But the weight of it was real. The people carrying that weight were no longer carrying it quietly. Every complicated story has a moment where the smaller accumulating things stop being separate and become one thing. Where the fragments finally connect into a shape. Where the quiet, persistent instinct that something wasn't right, the one people had been carrying without quite being able to name it, suddenly has a form they can hold in their hands. That moment arrived in Camron's story. The precise details around it have not been made fully public. But those with direct knowledge of the situation have described it as a moment of convergence, a point at which threads that had been developing separately in different directions, at different speeds, suddenly ran into each other in a way that could no longer be managed or deflected or set aside. For Camron, this was the moment that changed the nature of his situation in a fundamental way. Up until that point, he had retained real control over how the story read. The questions were out there, but they were scattered. The concern was real, but it hadn't found its center yet. And in that kind of environment, diffuse suspicion, unfocused unease, a skilled and careful person can keep things managed, keep the narrative from consolidating around anything specific. What this moment did was collapse that diffusion. It gave everything a center, a place where the threads met. According to reports, those who had been quietly and patiently gathering information found something, or a convergence of things, that was genuinely difficult to interpret in any way that left the existing version of events intact. The full specifics of what was uncovered remain, in part, contested. No official conclusion has been reached regarding the complete scope of what was found. But the effect on the people involved is not contested. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with this specific discovery, the discovery that someone you had genuinely respected, someone you had built real trust around, had been operating from a position that was not fully transparent with you. It is not the sharp, acute grief of sudden loss. It is slower, more complicated. It is the grief of having to revise not just your understanding of a person, but your understanding of your own experience, your own history, your own judgment. People who had spent years close to Camron were now doing that revision. And Camron himself, according to those who were in a position to observe him during this period, was facing something that even his considerable, long-practiced ability to manage appearances could not fully absorb. The composure was still visible, but the effort behind it for the first time was visible too. The thing about a story like this, the thing that makes it genuinely difficult to sit with, is that it refuses to resolve into something clean. There is a version of it that wants to exist. A simpler version. One where Camron Guthrie is straightforwardly deceptive, someone who made a clear and conscious choice to build a false reality around himself, who sustained it without regret, who prioritized his own interests above everything else. That version is emotionally satisfying. It offers structure, a clear wrong, an implied correction, the comfort of a moral that lands cleanly. But the people who actually know him, including some of the people who feel most affected by what came to light, don't tend to reach for that version when they talk about him. What they describe is something harder to categorize. A person who, somewhere along the way, possibly under real pressure, possibly out of genuine fear, possibly out of a belief, however misguided, that exposure would cause more damage than concealment, made a choice to contain something rather than bring it into the open. And who then found, over time, that the containment had become structural. That the life built around it had grown up in ways that made any kind of dismantling feel not just difficult, but genuinely impossible. None of that removes the impact on the people around him. Questions have been raised, and legitimately so, about what it means for someone to make decisions that affect others without giving those others access to the information they would have needed to make informed choices of their own. Those questions don't have comfortable answers, and they remain, in important respects, unresolved. But the human dimension beneath the structure of it, the part that resists being flattened into a single moral judgment, is real. And a version of this story that ignores it is not, ultimately, an honest one, because the story of Camron Guthrie is not only the story of what was hidden. It is the story of what hiding does, to everyone around the person keeping the secret and to the person keeping it. The way a secret, maintained across enough time and enough relationships, stops being a decision and becomes a condition. The way the sustained effort of keeping it reshapes everything else. Every relationship, every choice, every version of yourself you are capable of offering to the people in your life. By the time the full picture had emerged, or as much of it as had emerged, Camron was standing in a position that no carefully maintained image could shelter him from. The structure that had held everything in place was now fully visible to the people it had been built, for years around. What comes next for him, and for the people whose lives intersected with his, remained genuinely open. Stories like this one have a particular way of staying with you after they end. Not because they are the most dramatic thing you have ever heard, not because the specific facts are more extreme than anything else. They stay because they point towards something most people have touched quietly in their own lives at least once. The gap between who we actually are and who we allow the people around us to see. The weight of carrying something that feels too fragile, or too complicated, or too irreversible to bring into the open. The slow, quiet accumulation of small decisions made in the space between full transparency and careful concealment. Most people will never carry something at the scale Camron apparently carried. Most people will never build something this elaborate or maintain it for this long. But the root feeling, the instinct to protect something by keeping it hidden, the fear of what full honesty might cost, that is not foreign to the human experience. That is something closer to universal. That observation is not offered as a defense of what happened. The people who were affected by what was kept from them did not choose to be kept from it. Their trust was engaged genuinely over time, without their full knowledge of what they were trusting in. Whatever Camron's internal experience of that reality was, whatever reasoning or fear or pain existed inside the choice to continue, the external effect on others is real. It deserves to be named clearly and without softening, but the human complexity underneath it is also real. And a story that flattens that complexity, that turns a human situation into a clean allegory, isn't telling the whole truth. What remains after everything is a set of questions that don't resolve neatly, What do we genuinely owe to the people who trust us? What do we owe to ourselves? When those two things come into direct conflict, when full honesty with others feels like something close to self-erasure, how do people find their way through that? And when they don't find their way through it cleanly, when the choices they make produce real harm for people who deserved better, how do we hold that truth alongside the reality that the person who made those choices was still, in some irreducible way, a human being? No official conclusion has been reached on the full scope of this situation. And in some strange way, that feels appropriate, because the real questions this story raises are not the kind that close with a verdict. They are the kind that stay open, that live in you a little after you encounter them, that surface again quietly when something in your own life brushes up against them. Camron Guthrie will carry what happened. The people whose lives intersected with his will carry what they learned, and what it cost them to learn it. And those of us on the outside are left with something that is, depending on how you receive it, either deeply uncomfortable or genuinely valuable. A story that holds up a mirror without flinching, and asks what we would find if someone looked this carefully at us. That is not a comfortable question, it was never going to be, but it might be one worth sitting with. If this story reached you, if it made you think about trust or identity or the quiet weight of what we protect and why, then take a moment before you move on. Leave a thought in the comments. The conversations that grow from stories like this one are always worth having, and we genuinely read what people share there. If you want more stories told with this kind of care and depth, subscribing costs you nothing and means you won't miss the next one. We'll see you there.